Conjugate periodization, as popularized by Louie Simmons, was at one time not just popular, it was the way to train. And if you weren't doing it, you were wrong. This style of training has fallen out of favor recently with the rise of drug-free raw powerlifting, but I've still had a number of conversations even recently with lifters and other coaches that got me wanting to make this video on why I don't use Westside Conjugate, and I don't think that you should either. Okay, so I have a lot of things to get out of the way before I really start. First and foremost is that I don't hate this system and I don't dislike its creator. I've actually been to Westside, I've met and spoken with Louie, and he was without a doubt one of the smartest and most generous coaches that I've ever come into contact with in my career. And what he did for the sport of powerlifting it far surpasses what I'm ever going to be capable of. So I have a tremendous amount of respect for Louie and for the legend that is Westside. And the other thing is that I consider Louie to be a true innovator in every sense of the word. And what people forget about that is the burden of being first, especially people who criticize him. Like I said, he paved the way for a lot of modern powerlifting knowledge. But that doesn't mean he was right about everything or that he should be criticized for getting a couple of things wrong. I'm also going to quickly note that I'm only talking about Westside Conjugate in the context of powerlifting. I come from a strength and conditioning background in sport, and I think there are plenty of applications therein where this style of arranging training might be more useful. And lastly, these are just my opinions. These are not statements of fact. And really importantly to me is that if you love Conjugate and that it works really, really well for you, keep doing it. I'm a big believer in the fact that if something works, it doesn't matter why it works. You just keep doing it. And with all that being said, here are my 3 main issues with Westside Conjugate. Number 1 is the idea of constantly rotating exercises. Louie used to talk about the law of accommodation, meaning that you could not do the same thing 2 to 3 weeks in a row and expect to get better at it. And in fact, he's well documented as having said that you will get worse if you keep doing it this way, which is basically categorically untrue. If you look at any top lifter today, and plenty of examples throughout history, you'll notice that a lot of them have been doing the exact same 3 movements day in, day out for decades on end and continue getting better with time. Westsiders also seem to discount the idea that repeated technical exposures can be beneficial. You'll often hear them saying things like, oh, once you know how to squat, you're never going to forget, and we can keep constantly rotating exercises because we don't need that technical practice. And while that might be true to some extent, lifting technique specifically is 100% a skill that can and needs to be sharpened with practice. If you've ever noticed how if you take a few weeks off from squatting, for example, when you come back to it, it feels really, really weird, that would be an example of this effect in action. So suffice my issue with this to be that there is nothing wrong with doing the same exercises week in, week out for extended periods of time, and that technical practice is important. My second issue would be with the concept of the dynamic effort method or of speed work in general. And this is, I feel like, the most commonly cited problem that I hear people having with Westside. And no, there's nothing inherently wrong with training a lift at lower percentage 1 rep max, and there's nothing inherently wrong with trying to lift that weight as fast as possible. In fact, you should probably be trying to lift all of your weights as fast as possible. That part I believe to be true. The issue arises when you believe that this style of training is mandatory for powerlifting. You've probably seen some advocate of Westside Conjugate write force equals mass times acceleration on a whiteboard somewhere and use that as justification for why you need speed work to maximize your competition lifts. They make it sound all fine and dandy until you realize that maximal force outputs, like the kind we do in powerlifting, are performed at very, very low velocities, not high velocities. And that what you're actually training with traditional Westside speed work is power output, which despite the name is actually not super important to the success of a power lifter. The force velocity curve is fairly specific, and the further away from the competition exercise that you get in either direction, the less carryover you can tend to expect. And in fairness, this is partly why I said I think this system might have more application in stuff like field sports, where power output is actually far more important than absolute strength, but not for powerlifters. And the third issue that I take with Westside Conjugate in general is the necessity of accommodating resistance. It's just not truly Westside without bands and chains. I actually like bands and chains for certain exercises from time to time, but I'll spoil it for you. We know from more recent research that these methods of loading are not superior to traditional straight weight when it comes to building strength. I believe the reason it worked so well for Westside, which is undeniable, by the way, that it worked well for them, is because these guys were competing almost exclusively in equipment, squat suits, bench shirts, etc., which assist you primarily out of the bottom of a lift. So when training raw, bands and chains really do mimic the strength curve of equipped lifting. Not so much for raw lifting though, where the hardest part of the lift is typically at or near the bottom, which is actually where bands and chains make the lift the easiest. So, while I do think that these have plenty of applications for equipped lifters, their utility for raw lifters is definitely questionable, and they are not necessary or indeed optimal for a raw power lifter to maximize their strength. And that's what I've got for today. Now, these were just the big three that come to mind, but there are plenty of other smaller things that I take a philosophical opposition to. So I'd be happy to make a part 2 to this video. I'd also be equally happy to talk about the things that I really like about Westside Conjugate if you guys are interested in that. I'd love to hear your opinions about Westside and the Conjugate system as well, and I will get back to you if you leave them in the comments here for me. And until next time, happy lifting.